December 24th, 1944. An invisible rain fell from the sky, and within hours, a force of roughly 20,000 men that had marched with confidence was broken, scattered, and in many places simply no longer cohesive. It did not come from an extra battalion, nor from an air armada. It came from an idea sealed inside a shell, a tiny secret device that detonated explosions above the ground instead of letting them bury into it. That small innovation, born in laboratories and hidden in munition depots, turned foxholes into traps and turned an assault that had seemed unstoppable into a rout. In the map of the Ardennes that winter, lines and arrows told a desperate story. Adolf Hitler ordered a blitz through the forests toward Antwerp, and on December 14th he set an impossible deadline. A spearhead must reach the port within 4 days. Sepp Dietrich, an SS commander entrusted with the northern shoulder of the offensive, marshaled some of the Third Reich's most fanatical formations. Units swollen with hardened SS veterans and, unnervingly, youthful contingents drawn from indoctrinated Hitler youth battalions. Together they numbered around 20,000 men. Their plan relied on shock and momentum, a rapid punch through what Hitler hoped would be weak, thinly held Allied positions. The terrain had other plans. The Ardennes was a tangle of narrow lanes and slate-grey ridges, dense woods and steep hollows, all glazed with ice and snow that December. Roads choked under the weight of armor and supply columns. Trucks slid into ditches or sat idle behind wrecked tanks. Fuel was scarce. The supply chain for a mechanized thrust had been stretched nearly to breaking. Mechanical readiness ebbed, as much of the German advance suffered not from bullets but from blocked highways and empty tanks. The clock, however, had been set, and Dietrich pushed forward regardless. Weather became a weapon in its own right. A heavy, low cloud and a ground fog settled over the forest, a soft, concealing blanket that grounded Allied aircraft and scrubbed the skies of reconnaissance. To German commanders, this was a gift. Without air interdiction, their columns could move with less fear of strafing or precision bombing. By the time they reached the forward lines on December 16th and began the assault in force, there was a grim confidence among the attackers. After the initial successes, they believed the momentum could carry them to Antwerp. On the Allied side, a different kind of steady held. The U.S. 99th Infantry Division, inexperienced in some respects but disciplined and dug in, occupied positions on Elsenborn Ridge. American doctrine emphasized defense in depth, foxholes, reverse slopes, overlapping fields of fire, and above all, artillery. For years, artillery had been the king of the battlefield. Observers called for barrages and fire missions as instinctively as they breathed. The 99th's gunners had trained to work with terrain, indirect fire, pre-planned concentrations, and the ability to call down high-angle shells that would break up massed attacks. But the Ardennes offered a challenge to that wisdom. In the frozen ground and thick forest, shells did not always behave in textbook fashion. When a steel shell with a contact fuse hit the hard, icy soil, much of its energy could be absorbed as it buried and detonated in the earth. Instead of tearing through entrenchments from above, explosions tended to scavenge their force into the crust, throwing less lethal fragmentation outward and failing to produce the airbursts artillery officers relied upon to clear entrenched positions. For days, German formations pressed the attack, hoping sheer numbers and weight would blunt the American defense. They had survived similar barrages before. Their training, their doctrine, and their belief in shock were intact. Then the fog lifted. On December 23rd, 24, as sunlight finally burned through and Allied aircraft could operate again, a different decision was coming from a different room. A command space far from the riddled roads of the Ardennes. In the months and years before that winter, American scientists and engineers, many working under intense secrecy at institutions such as the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, had developed a new kind of fuse. It was called in shorthand a variable time or VT fuse. The idea was not mystical, it was an application of physics, of radio waves and motion detection, to an age-old problem. Concealed within the nose of a shell, a tiny transceiver would listen for changes in the reflected radio signal as the shell approached the ground. Those changes, what an engineer might liken to the Doppler shift of a passing siren, could be measured and used to trigger detonation at a chosen point above the Earth. The principle was simple to grasp, though deceptively complex to engineer. If a shell could detonate while still airborne, its fragments would scatter downward, striking exposed tops of trenches, open ground, and the tops of armored vehicles with far greater lethality than a buried explosion. In the Ardennes, where shells had been largely dissipating their force by embedding in frozen soil, the capacity for a consistent airburst was a potential game-changer. Because the fuse was classified and unfamiliar, approval for its use was controlled at the highest levels. The decision to release the VT rounds into the Ardennes was not made lightly. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, charged with the overall Allied command, authorized their use under strict conditions as the fog cleared and the strategic circumstances shifted. It was a balance of risk and necessity. The Allies had held a powerful secret that could change the fight if applied, but only in such a way as to minimize compromise and maximize effect. When the VT-fused shells arrived on the battlefield on December 24th, they did not arrive as an obvious new armament. They rode the same trajectories, were fired from the same guns, and appeared identical to the men who shouted the firing orders. The difference would only be felt at the impact zone. The first salvos, with the variable time fuse, were aimed into the massed German assault formations that had pressed up against the Elsenborn positions. Observers watched and listened. Then the air itself changed. There was a moment of uncanny silence as the shells arced, and then, without the ground-shaking thud that marked a contact detonation, they detonated above the tree line. The effect was immediate. Steel fragments traveling at supersonic speed shifted the geometry of survival for those in the open or in shallow protection. A foxhole that had protected a man up to the lip of his shoulders could no longer be presumed safe when the ceiling of the world itself erupted with vertical shrapnel. Men who had trained for indirect fire now felt the opposite. The sky became the threat. The depiction of that moment cannot be reduced to gore without betraying its meaning. Instead, consider the psychology. Soldiers had been taught to duck, to hug the ground, to trust the earth to absorb and deflect. Now the very act of being lower did not guarantee safety. The airburst sprayed deadly fragments straight down. Communication lines were severed not only by blast, but by the sudden confusion. Soldiers staggered. Leaders could not see or be seen. Radios were knocked from hands or destroyed by shrapnel. Unit cohesion, already tested by the cold and weeks of maneuver, collapsed in minutes. Where formations had once been able to reconstitute under fire, they found themselves fragmented into small, shocked clumps. The numerical effect was terrifying in its economy. Of the roughly 20,000 German troops committed to Dietrich's shoulder, casualties and incapacitation rates across the assaulting divisions rose sharply in the wake of the VT employment. Reports from the field, cautious with numbers because exact accounting in the fog of war is always imperfect, suggested substantial losses. Units shattered, command posts knocked out, and armored vehicles disabled either by direct hits or immobilized by the loss of infantry support and fuel. Tanks that had advanced with infantry to support the spearhead found themselves isolated, bogged down on narrow roads or bereft of the crews and logistic lines needed to keep them moving. The offensive, which had relied on a compact window of momentum and short supply lines, could not afford such sudden, disproportionate attrition. This was not a cinematic deus ex machina that single-handedly resolved the war. It was one decisive factor in a brittle chain. The VT fuse did what it was designed to do. It produced consistent airbursts that neutralized a particular defensive vulnerability and disrupted the German pattern of attack. In the specific context of the Ardennes at that moment, its introduction turned the tide against Dietrich's formations. Once the attackers lost mass coherence and the momentum of the advance, the logistical nightmares, already severe, became fatal to the operation's prospects. Without steady fuel and supply, and with the roads choked and vehicles disabled, the possibility of pushing through to Antwerp in 4 days or ever evaporated. There are human stories threaded through this technical turn. One American forward observer, who had been calling in fire from a ridge, later remembered the odd, sharp double whistle of shells passing overhead before the detonation, an auditory memory that, when paired with the visual of splintered trees and motionless bodies, stayed with him long after. German survivors, captured or retreating, spoke not of strategic genius, but of bewilderment. Their tactics had worked in many fields before, but now something unseen was killing men who thought they were safe in places that had always sheltered them. Those testimonies, filtered through reports and interrogations, conveyed a common image: men suddenly vulnerable under a sky that had become hostile in a new, inescapable way. The tactical novelty was underpinned by a broader strategic truth. Industry and science had become as central to victory as courage and leadership. The VT fuse was not merely a battlefield gimmick. It represented a fusion of laboratory research, testing, mass production, and operational secrecy. The United States, by mid-1944, had marshaled a capacity to conceive, refine, and field innovations at unprecedented scale. Factories converted to wartime output, engineers solved previously intractable problems, and the logistical apparatus delivered new tools into combat zones with an efficiency that reshaped possibilities. This did not render human factors irrelevant. Training, morale, leadership, and audacity remained critical. The Allied victory in the Ardennes, like any complex engagement, was the product of multiple inputs: intelligence, weather changes, tactical responses, and the willingness to use novel tools when the moment demanded. Yet the VT fuse served as a clear illustration of how a relatively small technological advantage, deployed at a decisive moment, could have outsized consequences. Where doctrine and courage had expected the known behavior of munitions and terrain, a hidden physics experiment had rewritten the play. Ethics and secrecy hovered over the decision to use such weapons. The proximity fuse had been developed in guarded secrecy, partly because of concerns that if the enemy learned the mechanism, they would be able to counter or replicate it. That same secrecy raised questions about the rules of engagement. Within military command, the calculus favored saving lives and securing objectives by any lawful means, and the fuse was judged a legal and effective munition. Historians and ethicists since have debated the implications of introducing such technologies into warfare. In the moment, the priority for Eisenhower and his advisors was clear: blunt the offensive and reduce Allied casualties by leveraging an advantage that could be applied surgically and with strategic effect. As the assault stalled and then retreated, the picture of attrition began to form. Estimates of Germans killed, wounded, or captured varied by report, but the scale was unmistakable. Large portions of the attacking formation were either combat ineffective or forced into chaotic withdrawal. Dietrich's hopes for a quick, decisive break to Antwerp had been effectively ended after those days of fighting that culminated in the late December airbursts. Strategically, the Battle of the Bulge still exacted a cost on both sides, a winter campaign of tremendous suffering, but the introduction of the VT fuse during those critical hours decisively blunted the particular thrust that had threatened to change the course of the front. There is also a lesson in how innovation diffuses. The VT fuse had been the product of sustained investment in scientific institutions, places where theoretical physicists, radio engineers, and ordnance specialists worked long before the bullets flew. Their output crystallized in a device that was not necessarily glamorous, but that married detection, timing, and durability into a shell nose small enough to survive firing yet sensitive enough to trigger at the right moment. The result was not only a weapon, but an organizational triumph. Research directed toward immediate practical ends, manufacturing that could move from prototype to production, and military leadership ready to release a guarded secret when the stakes demanded it. But technology alone does not account for victory. The Allies' capacity to integrate intelligence, air power, supply, and manpower, combined with German overreach and miscalculation, composed the larger frame. Hitler's timetable, driven by political fantasy and desperation, compressed decision cycles. German units, stretched thin and in some cases filled with raw recruits, could not absorb the unexpected shock in the same way a better-fed and better-supplied force might have. So while the VT fuse was a catalytic factor, it was embedded in a complex system of cause and effect. In the aftermath, commanders on both sides would acknowledge the fuse's value and the disturbing new geometry it introduced to infantry survival. For the men on the ground, the memory was simple. The sky no longer offered mercy in the form it had before. For historians and strategists, the episode served as an object lesson about how quiet innovations in laboratories could have dramatic, visible consequences on front lines. A handful of engineers tinkered with radio echoes. An entire offensive unraveled. The narrative returns, finally, to the paradox promised by the title, unseen and unstoppable. The weapon was unseen in the sense that its mechanism relied on invisible radio waves and a secretive development program. It seemed unstoppable because, in the short term and in that particular context, it produced a rapid, brutal reversal of fortunes. Yet the word unstoppable required tempering. The fuse's effect was decisive at Elsenborn Ridge and in the sectors where it was employed, but it did not negate the many dimensions of war: logistics, leadership, intelligence, and sheer manpower. It was instead a stark example of a much larger truth. Modern war had become an interplay of ideas, industry, and physics as much as it was a contest of wills. History kept other accounts. Some German survivors spoke of exhaustion and disillusion, of being led into a fight that relied on faith rather than on supply. Some American veterans remembered how fear gave way to professional competence, how gunners adapted their fire plans to exploit a new tool. Analysts later pointed to the episode as emblematic of 20th century conflict, when industrial capacity and scientific ingenuity concentrate behind an objective, the tactical horizon shifts, often suddenly. On that winter day, a small piece of industrial ingenuity, conceived in a laboratory, shaped by engineers, mass-produced in factories, and delivered by logistics, had altered the shape of a battle. The immediate human cost was heavy. Lives were lost and families broken, and that solemn fact is the first anchor in any sober account. Beyond the cost, however, the episode crystallized an idea about warfare's evolution. Secrecy, science, and production could confer a form of force multiplication that, when unleashed at a critical point, reshaped outcomes. If there is a final image that lingers, it is not of a single weapon triumphing over human bravery, but of a landscape transformed by an innovation so quiet that until the moment of use, it could be mistaken for a rumor. Men on both sides fought with courage and fear. Leaders gambled and miscalculated. Roads and fuel and weather conspired, and into that fraught mix a small radio-guided device fell and made the sky lethal in a new way. The result was decisive for that assault, a stark lesson that in modern conflict the unseen can be as consequential as the seen. If this story is striking you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and what battlefield innovation you'd like explored next. The battle at Elsenborn Ridge remains a vivid chapter in which science and industrial capacity met foot soldiers on a frozen ridge, and the consequences were immediate and brutal. For viewers who want to dig deeper, consider exploring more on the Battle of the Bulge and the story of wartime innovation. There are entire episodes and archives that follow the chain from laboratory to front line. If you found this account illuminating, like and subscribe for more detailed narratives on military technology and pivotal battles. And check the playlist on innovations that altered the course of World War II.